Since 1785, the Times has been essential reading.
Now, it's essential listening.
Times Radio chooses conversation over confrontation.
Covers Westminster and beyond.
Ask the right questions.
To keep you well informed.
We give words space and let the stories do the talking.
Listen on DAB radio, online, on your smart speaker or via our app.
Good afternoon and welcome. I have to say it's quite overwhelming and extraordinary to see all of you in person in an auditorium and all of us together. Thank you so much to all of those who make the Cheltenham Literary Festival possible. This is really remarkable. We have an extraordinary set of authors today to talk about Joe Biden, a quiet revolutionary ? I am Leslie Vinjamuri. I direct the U.S. and Americas program at Chatham House. I'm also dean of our Queen Elizabeth II Academy, and I'm on the faculty of the politics department at SOAS, University of London. We have, I'll start by introducing our speakers and then say a little bit about our topic, which I think is very well known to all of you. We have Ambassador Matthew Barzun sitting right next to me. He is most recently the author of The Power of Giving Away Power. Matthew is very well known, obviously, for his work in business, in politics, in diplomacy, as an author, as a co-founder and chair of Tortoise. He was the U.S. ambassador to Sweden under President Obama, 2009 to 2011. He was then the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom, 2013 to 2017. We all followed you. We followed your Twitter feed. And the thing I remember most when I was reading your Twitter feed was Matthew spent a huge amount of time speaking to young people across the UK about their impressions of the United States. And you used to say the first thing when you asked them, what did they think about America? The first thing that they thought was about guns. So not a happy thing, but it really stood out. Danny Finkelstein, obviously you're very well known to everybody here in the UK and far beyond. You have been with the Times in one form or another since 2001. You were executive editor from around 2008 to 2013 when you entered the House of Lords. Your book, Everything in Moderation, I don't have a copy with me, but you can imagine from the title, your position and your view on politics. You are also former chair of Policy Exchange, once advisor to John Major, to William Hague, and now you are chair of Onward. And I have to say as a starting point that I really believe in the basic notion of everything in moderation, but I'm not so sure that the world is on your side at the moment, but there we are. So let's start out with that. I guess the sort of exam question for the panel, is Joe Biden leading a quiet revolution? I just want to take us back to where we were. I think often when, it's very easy to be critical, but just as a reminder, on January 20th, when Joe Biden was inaugurated, actually he was inaugurated just before midday, which I thought was interesting because it's supposed to be at midday. It was 2 weeks to the day since the January 6th insurrection on the Capitol. It was at a moment in US history where 4,000 Americans were dying a day, where unemployment was much lower than it had been at the start of the pandemic and much higher than it is now, where growth was dramatically slowed, where there was deep polarization, as there is now in partisanship, over the question of opening up the economy, closing the economy, where attitudes in the United States towards China had hardened dramatically because of the wariness over the onset of COVID. But America then looked quite different than it does now, and we know what Joe Biden's trying to do. So I guess my question for you, as you look at his vision, as it's unfolded over the first 8.5 months, or about 8.5 months into his administration, one that he hoped would be characterized by partisanship at home, by working with allies and partners overseas, by delivering on his notion that America was back on the global stage and that it was going to build back better at home. So Joe Biden, quiet revolutionary. Let me start with you, Ambassador Barzun.
You have to call me Matthew. We agreed.
I just like to remind myself because it was such a nice period at Winfield House under your leadership.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for sharing this effort.
Revolutionary?
Okay, quick show of hands. How many people here like to lose an argument? Okay, so that was the question I would ask all these young British students that I'd get to meet with, 20,000 of them by the end. And there'd always be some sullen 18-year-old boy who would just be contrary in the back and raise his, always a guy, in the back. But my point is, like, none of us likes to lose an argument. So in answer to your question, I am not going to try to win one. And I don't know why we encourage so many people to try to win arguments if none of us like to lose them. I think Joe Biden, as a legislator for 40+ years and as a wonderful retail politician, he may not phrase it that way, but I think he has had that insight. So revolutionary, I mean, I wouldn't put it that way. Have you all been following, I think it's been in the news, I just got here from America, so I'm not aware, but he's trying to pass what's the $3.5 trillion, okay. So that number is a big number, you know? You know what happened the other day that I bet didn't make the news here and it didn't really make the news back home? Is we passed a $7.5 trillion package. Except we didn't call it that. We just passed the $700 billion defense authorization bill in a relatively bipartisan way. So the $3.5 trillion is 350 billion times 10, right? Or whatever that math, did I get that math right? I mean, you know what I mean? It's like, and so it's weird that all these Americans have 3.5 trillion, isn't this huge? It's like half of what we spend on defense for all the other things that are important in our lives, like children and education and health. And so in that context, that doesn't appear revolutionary. I mean, there are big changes, I don't want to minimize that.
So let me come to you, Daniel. E.J. Dionne wrote in, I think, the Washington Post in March, and he said, Joe Biden, quiet revolutionary, and he said, in fact, you know, Reaganomics came from stagflation. Joe Biden's transformation, investing in the working class, investing in the middle class, comes from the things that preceded it not working, and then, of course, the accelerant of COVID. So there will be a revolution. Joe Biden might be able to claim it, but it's not Joe Biden himself. What do you think?
So I looked at the question, you know, Joe Biden, a quiet revolutionary, and I thought, well, the Joe Biden bit, okay, that's fine. And I like the quiet bit, and the question mark is also good. The I can leave or take. And so we're left with the question revolutionary, right? And lots of people, when they make change, I'm having this argument at the moment on the question of assisted dying. Everyone who makes a change likes to aggrandize themselves by calling themselves revolutionaries, but you know, it's a bit like your question. Nobody actually much likes revolution. It's very destabilizing. People resist it in favor of the status quo. Social care, I always used to say, everyone is insisting the government has a policy on social care so that they can be against it. I always used to say this. And then the government came out with a policy on social care, and everyone's going, why have they got a policy on social care? Anyway, and they're against how it's financed and how it's organized. So my problem is that everyone loves to be seen as a revolutionary because it's aggrandizing, but no one wants a revolution. So I think there are two questions, which is, should Joe Biden even try to be a revolutionary? I think he should try and achieve sustainable change that means something in people's lives. And one of the failures of the 3.5 trillion package is that it's framed in terms of the amount, and people are going, I think we should have 1.5, and I'm thinking, well, why did you pick that figure or the other figure? What matters is, what is this going to achieve? So I think the first question for Joe Biden is, you know, is this sustainable? Can he achieve it? The second is, how will he make sure that he keeps winning on this agenda? Because one of the problems, I think the whole of the Western democracy faces now is that the Republican Party, which I was once happy to associate and talk to, has become quite dangerous. And so if the Republicans nominate another presidential candidate and they win, or they win control of the Senate, it has serious consequences for Western liberal democracy. So I'm concerned about Joe Biden presenting himself as a revolutionary, because I think people will resist that, even if the individual items are good. So I have a really big problem with that framing, but less of a problem with some of the things that he wants to do.
So maybe we set aside the frame just for a moment, but to your broader point, and I think it is, I'm glad that you raised the question of the Republican Party, because of course many people say it's the Republican Party that's singular in its focus, is playing the long game, it knows what it wants to do, and maybe that's where the revolution is. But if you just kind of look at, I understand what you were saying, Matthew, that 3.5 is really not so big if you compare it to defense spending. But some of the things that he's trying to do are significant in the American context, right? Child care, investing in women, investing in climate in a serious way. Remember, we're coming out of a period where we had an American president that denied the basic fact of climate change. So, if you just take the last 4 years on climate, the broader period on, expanding health care, universal tax credit, all sorts of things. Is there not an argument that, if he manages to get some of this through, that it does become the basis for a pretty significant change in the fabric of what Americans expect in their daily life from the government, and which we know is radically different from what we see here in the United Kingdom?
Yes. And I just love what Daniel said. And okay, so everyone made fun of Joe Biden when he started this campaign, that he wanted to heal the soul of a nation. And it's like, you can't do that in this climate. No one wants to hear healing, even if we want to be healed, And interestingly, he said heal, not cure. And I think I had a new doctor friend, Pakistani American, and he said to me, I was like, what have you learned in your life thus far? And he's like, patients don't want to be cured. They want to be healed. That always stuck with me. And so healing is not like curing. Curing is a lot more like solving a problem. And when you talked about winning, Daniel, I think in our political thing back home, if we frame it as winning, and I mean, there are big ramifications of parties staying in power in the next election and scary stuff. But if every interaction is about winning and losing, it just leads to a whole bunch of language and body language that doesn't look anything like healing. And you cannot fight to heal, I don't think.
Daniel, tell me a little bit more about how you read the Republican Party. We're going to come on to America and its sort of global role, which of course is what many of us here are concerned about. But I think we all know that there's a deep connection between what America does beyond its borders and the politics and the attacks on democracy at home. How do you see the Republican Party? Is it, kind of the headline that we read here, that it's going to dig in its heels, and that 2022 they take the House, 2024 maybe the presidency, and that's kind of the things come to a grinding halt?
I think that they've got, I think if you look at the figures, the chances of them being able to stop Joe Biden just by taking control of the Senate again in midterms is, reasonably strong. And I think that most people view politics themselves, their own politics, as if they were ideological. But if you step back, you realize they're primarily demographic. And that's the reason why there's such an awful lot of homogeneity between people in the same demographic group as to which, and their demographics come first and their sort of ideology tends to follow it. And the Republicans have ended up with a demographic where they're winning the votes of a lot of very wealthy people and then a lot of poorer, less well-educated people. And it's extremely difficult for them to find an agenda that unites both of those, and Trump found it in greater and greater racial provocation and other kinds of provocation, and he found it very successful. And either he or somebody else understanding that formula is going to try the same again. It seems to me the Democratic Party, which has an agenda that could appeal to the Trump people doesn't have the framing to do it. David Shaw, the pollster who I respect an awful lot, he basically says everyone who works as a consultant is themselves a highly educated liberal university graduate doing data science, and their politics and the politics of all the people who advise the politicians, even by the way on the Republican side, but particularly on the Democrat side, is way more liberal than most of the people, and also demographically quite alien to most of the people. So the Democratic Party is framing its policies and its appeal and its leadership for a smaller and smaller portion of the population, leaving the Republican Party to, with its sort of fairly provoking, dangerous agenda, to appeal to a broader swathe. And the electoral politics for the Democrat. I mean, 10 years ago, as Matthew knows, everyone was saying there's going to be a perpetual liberal democratic majority,
and it
right?
hasn't
Which
happened.
always seemed a bit ridiculous as an argument. But now, I think, if anything, the situation has turned round and it's the other way round.
So saying can you not revolution, but can you lead a transformative program in this domestic context, Matthew? Or is it?
Yes, and it calls for, and I think Biden is very well equipped to do this, it calls for a phrase that we don't use. It's a weird phrase, and I get a little bit into the book about this, but we need domestic diplomacy. And I mean, I remember when I came over to this country in 2013, the guy who was here before me was joking. He's like, well, let me see, I had a royal wedding, a diamond jubilee, and London 2012 Olympics. You're going to have Scottish referendum. We didn't call it Brexit back then, but, should the UK remain in the EU? And then what he anticipated correctly to be a bitterly divisive presidential campaign of 2016. And so my time here, it was those things and other things. And so it wasn't really like, oh, is the occupant of number 10 getting along with the occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, or even official Washington with official London. It was like, how are we doing internally, and people talking at each other, past each other, or not talking at all, to your point. And just one quick story about, so Joe Biden came to Louisville, where I live in Kentucky, before he ran for president, and he told this story that I'll just quickly summarize, and I think he would agree with what you said. So this is back when he's working as vice president for Obama, and he's like, we need to do something for the middle class. Now our definition, it's different than the way you all say middle class. So this is sort of like working class and middle class is the way we think of it. And so Biden was in charge of it. And so every big department in government was supposed to bring something forth, and no one was doing it. So he finally gets together. He picks 5 junior members of his staff who he knew grew up in properly working class. So-and-so's mother was a janitor, so-and-so's father worked on the factory, blah, blah, that kind of gets them all on the team. And finally, the Treasury Department comes in with their plan. And they're very excited because I think they have a really good middle class thing. And they're like, we're going to open up and uncap people's ability to invest in 529 plans to save for their kids for college. The 5 people on the middle class task force, handpicked, are wildly enthusiastic with their colleagues at Treasury. And then it comes to Biden, who's chairing the meeting. He's like, you have got to be kidding. And he's like, do you think real people out there have a 529 account? And they're like, yes, sir, you're sort of old, sir. Like, I mean, I didn't say that. But, no, we know. And he's like, I don't know the data. There is no chance that there is a double-digit percentage of Americans who have a 529 savings account for their children. And they all took the other side of the bet. And he's like, if I lose the bet, I will buy you all lunch for the rest of Obama's term. And he's famously the poorest senator at the time, so he didn't have lots of spare cash. And the answer came back 7%.
Sorry, 7%.
7% of Americans had this, which he just instinctively knew. And he calls it class cluelessness. He's like, how quickly you forget. He has not forgotten.
It is the interesting thing about President Biden, isn't it? He's clearly, on the one hand, he's an insider. He's been in Washington and the Senate for a very long time. He's been vice president. He's now president. But he does come from a modest background. He comes from a part of the country that's modest, Delaware. So he does seem to have his finger more on the pulse. But you sort of nicely pivoted us towards the rest of the world in discussing your time here. I mean, the other part of Biden's agenda that people seem to really contest is America back in the world? He's taken America back into Paris, back into the multilateral framework, even that which hadn't formally, that America hadn't formally exited at some level in a deep way. It had exited, even NATO, right? But now, of course, we hear a lot of people saying, it's still America first. It's just a different version. It's Americans first. That Joe Biden, he did Afghanistan despite what Europe wanted. He's picking and choosing his partners on the global stage. In AUKUS, he's chosen Australia, or Australia has chosen the UK and Britain, but France has been left behind. And so this whole notion that America's back and it's on behalf of the world and delivering on climate and vaccines and all the rest of it we're just not seeing it. And so I think we've now 8.5 months in, we've reached deep skepticism about this. Are we just, not giving the man who inherited 4,000 Americans a day dying, an economy that was on the edge of collapse, a government in which, for the first time in the history of the United States, we thought there wouldn't necessarily be a peaceful transition? Are we just not giving him enough time? Or is the Build Back Better agenda not as much as it's cracked up to be? Daniel, why don't you...
So look, the American influence in the world was obviously partly the size of its military contributions in 2 wars and the size of its military spending after those things. But it was also because people saw it as an example of a successful society. And I was reading an amazing book, which is Mark Lewison's History of the Beatles. And there's an extended edition, which goes on and on, unless you're interested in the Beatles. You think it's absolutely riveting, which I did. But most of this book is really about the influence of American culture in shaping modern Britain, and how rock music was really just American music, and it was the importation through Liverpool, which is a port town, of American culture. And when I read that, I realized that a lot of post-war American influence and leadership is about the sheer force of the American success story. People looked at America as being incredibly successful and thought, we can be led by that, we can attach ourselves to that example, and in addition, they're going to spend a lot of money to defend the West. So it was both of those things. I think that because of Trump's leadership, there has been question marks, again, over both of those things. People are looking at the United States and thinking that is a society that's got a lot of deep problems. A lot of the politics are becoming racial, which is difficult to translate into British terms. So, it used to be the case that the British Conservative Party, I know that myself, in 1996, I went to the Republican convention and we then used some of Jack Kemp's language, which he'd learned from Margaret Thatcher back at our conference, which was about opportunity for all. We learned a lot, and he was the vice presidential running mate for Bob Dole in that convention. So we used to learn, that wouldn't work now because the politics are operating on different bases. So I think some of America's success will be about its commitment in the world, but a lot of it will be about restoring its success as a society, which I profoundly hope. And I broadly think Joe Biden has the right idea about how to do that. It's just, it is a bit like, I think levelling up is a good idea too, but both those things are really hard to achieve. So you wonder whether we'll make progress on either.
Matthew, what do you think? Do you think we're judging his... I mean, it's very interesting what you say about it's sort of America's soft power. It's what America is, what it represents, that's as important as what it actually does in getting into the multilaterals. I would add one thing before we come to Matthew, which is, when Joe Biden came into power, he very quickly renewed Trump's travel ban, which basically meant that the majority of people living in this country and living in Europe haven't gone to the United States. So that soft power element is being largely communicated to Brits and to Europeans through the media, which is a tremendous responsibility, right, for telling the story of what's actually happening within the United States, and one that I think, I have to say, when I go to the United States, I'm always surprised at how good it is, which isn't to say it's always good, but it's certainly not as bad as I think as we start to feel when we're only experiencing the U.S., vicariously. Matthew, what do you think? Is it too soon to assess what Biden's able to do on the global stage, whether America is really back, whether he's revolutionizing America's global engagements, resetting the extent of its military engagements, its soft power, its sort of global commitments?
I don't know is the honest answer. I mean, I think there's something troubling about that word back. It's very effective. Take back control in this country was wherever you came out on that issue, it cut through and resonated. Biden's Build Back Better. You talk to a bunch of people in Louisville, where I live, who don't necessarily look like I do, and they're like, I don't want to build back what we had before at all. It wasn't so great for me. And so that word back is really loaded, and it's a myth. I mean, to your point of like, the end of history, perpetual democratic control, it's these myths. And I was actually reading the wonderful, and I want to recommend, I'm going to get the title wrong, but the wonderful thing you and Charlie Kupchan co-edited for Chatham House and for Council on Foreign Relations. You would remember, it's Anchoring
the World.
So it's called Anchoring the World, and it starts with a great essay by Leslie and Charlie Kupchan, and then all these other voices, Anne-Marie Slaughter, some wonderful divergent voices on American foreign policy, and it's really worth reading. And I thought, what a strange image, word. Like, do we want an anchor? I don't think we want an anchor. Like, it's just like, stop, slow down. It's like we are not collectively or universally in a calm port. We are moving down the river of life and history, and get on. And an anchor is not what we need. We may be ballast in the ship or something, but not. So I think those images, and I remember I was part of this wonderful group that was trying to get together. I was not wonderful, but the other people organizing it were sort of, what should American foreign policy be in anticipation of Biden winning? It wasn't partisan, but it was probably mostly former Obama types. And so I participated in one of their Zoom workshops, and they did 50 of them. And so I got sent the PDF printout, and I was excited to see it. And what they had chosen for the cover was like a map. It was like a map of the world or something like that, with just a missing jigsaw puzzle piece. And I thought, isn't that fascinating? Like, we've heard to all these divergent views, and we have to come up with the perfectly shaped piece, and then everything will be fine. And I think that is a visual cliche that does real harm. It isn't true, and it's unhelpful.
It's interesting because I've written about the fact that Make America Great was not Make America Great, it was Make America Great Again. And actually Ronald Reagan, so his slogan was, it's morning in America, everyone always remembers that. He actually said it's morning in America again, right? There's a feeling, a sort of nostalgia, and actually we have it obviously also here as well, but I think it's particularly strong that you can get back to a kind of period of prosperity in the 50s that, as you correctly say, a lot of people didn't share in. So I do agree with you that this sort of nostalgia isn't actually very helpful, and it's present on both sides in the US. It's present here too.
I was watching I forget what it was about, but it was 1992 Clinton-Gore campaign rally, and they just pan across the Clinton-Gore campaign posters, and it says, Make America Great Again. I mean, it's not a partisan thing, it's just a good line, for doing what you said.
It is interesting, though, because at home, of course, in the United States, a big part of the agenda is the Black Lives Matter agenda, right? It's multicultural, it's diversity, it's infusing that in public policy, it's bringing those voices in. And it doesn't, as you so rightly said, it doesn't really fit with the going back. On the global stage, I think that the narrative that we hear, and it, again, both of you make a very important point. It's about the need to recreate the global order so that it delivers to all people, so that we can deal with the inequality problem, deal with delivering public goods on a global stage. But I want to come back. I know you have thoughts on vaccines, but before we talk about that, in your time as ambassador to the UK, you spent a lot of time just talking to people across the entire country. I was always very impressed by that. And so, if we think of this as being a very different period of how people see the U.S., Is it so different? I mean, in your conversations with young people and people of all age across the country, what was the perception then? And is your sense that it's radically different now?
Well, the big learning, as you talked about, was in these workshops. So guns was number one. 20,000 A5 cards I have back home in Kentucky. 10,000 of them are the exact same doodle of a handgun. Followed by racism, followed by police brutality. So this is 2013 through 17. So this is before George Floyd, before Breonna Taylor, who was from Louisville, where I live. So, and I remember showing it to President Obama and showing it to Secretary of State John Kerry. I would make a word cloud every time we did a new school. It would never change, but it would be more people in the denominator or whatever. And I thought it was kind of subtle. It wasn't very subtle, but I would put guns and racism and police brutality and healthcare was number 4 in red, and then I'd put America's support for Israel in blue, drone policy blue, surveillance, Edward Snowden-y kind of things. Those things would all come up. They were in blue. So one is domestic policy, one is foreign policy. And the blue words are there, they're just tiny, you know? And so domestic policy is foreign policy. And
just imagining this house, he's got 10,000 doodles of a handgun.
Yeah, in my attic.
Where'd you put them? Okay.
I miss you guys. No, it's the point about the Beatles.
Yeah.
It's this stuff goes both ways. And on the flip side, we spend 5 minutes at the end of every session saying, what inspires you? What do you like about America? Because, you know, and there wasn't one big one like guns, but it was opportunity, diversity, freedom, food, sport. You know, okay.
Well, I believe one of the columns I've written this week is about economic growth. I believe at the bottom of, we always think that at the bottom of it is social media or it's economic growth. If economic growth in the West begins to lag, and it's smaller now as a trend rate than it was in the 1950s and 60s, all sorts of discontents will happen. And the reason is simple. If you're asking people for to improve, I don't know, childcare or facilities or education, and you have to take the money from somebody, it's much more difficult politically than if the whole economy is growing and you can take it out of growth and everyone can still get better off. So the key thing in this argument is for us to make our societies more successful economically. I believe if we can do that, they'll be more successful socially. You can try and sell the idea of liberal capitalism as being incredibly progressive and in terms of lifting people out of poverty and in terms of tolerance and liberalism. And I think that's correct, but you'll only persuade people of it if it actually does grow. And so that is the most important task ahead of all of us.
So I'm glad you said that, because it gets us on to, at some level, where the rubber really hits the road in all of this, which is that we know that we are on the edge of not being competitive. And I mean we, the United States, Europe, the so-called West. And this is, you know, in a sense, this is the other part of the revolutionary agenda. It's meant to be that Joe Biden has entered the White House. He is going to walk back the US and the UK and NATO's commitments to things that aren't vital, that aren't essential. At the same time, he's going to make America and Europe much more competitive on artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. Why? Because China's the big threat. China has the power and the capacity and the form of techno-authoritarianism that allows it to drive forward investment. And so at the same time, Joe Biden's meant to be delivering on all the good public goods, whether it's climate or vaccines or any other number of things. So do you see, you know, we've had 8.5 months of this president sort of trying to do these things at home and trying to fight the good fight, make the West more competitive, stand up to China, and be sure that, you know, the US and the UK and Europe are all working together to do that. How do you rate him on this part of the revolution, evolution, transition?
I think it's just very early in that process, because it's a long process. We've got to essentially engage in a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom. We need to produce. We're never going to succeed to make our low-cost, low-value-added goods competitive with developing countries, including especially China. The answer has got to be, and we're going to be challenged enough on this, the answer has got to be, I suppose it's, instead of attacking the metropolitan elite, we should be putting it to work, making money for everyone. And because lots of the jobs of the future that add value are going to require those kind of skills, I'm personally in favour of our policy of more and more people going to university. I know some people have attacked that. I think it's good. And we have got to try to, and I think the United States is doing the same, has got to try to make these people successful economically. So the answer on Joe Biden is it's very early, and I think the question of whether he sustains it is partly a question of whether his vision can remain in power for that long. He only won by a bit. He's only got a bit of control of Congress. It's a question of whether he's going to retain it and for how long. And these are policies that require sustained investment, focus and concentration, which is the issue we discuss in this country. You know, we've got the rhetoric, we understand what we're trying to do. Do we have the focus and concentration to do it? So I am pleased that Joe Biden has identified the correct issues. I think, personally, I've always found him a very attractive, for obvious reasons, I've always found him a very attractive politician. You know, I've wanted him to be president since 1988. I'm really happy that he is.
That's so cool.
But he's, you know, he's got to then do it over a sustained period, and there's a question of whether he'll be able to do that.
Does he have the West on his side? You were ambassador here for several years. You have you must have the best lens into the relationship between the U.S. and the U.K. You know, we've had all these horrendous headlines since early mid-August surrounding Afghanistan and carrying on any number of issues that the alliance is not holding together. That how can you fight the big fight? How can you be competitive? How can you deliver the big public goods if the U.S. and France, you know, that we've had our third high-level diplomatic visit by Americans to France this week, not because things are in a good place, but because they aren't. Things look better between the U.S. and the U.K., but you know, if you can't get it together, right? In the transatlantic space, then can you really deliver on an agenda of being competitive against China?
Yes, enthusiastically. You can, and this is something. Well, you start out with the West, and I think that sort of lives at a level of abstraction where no one lives or hopes or laughs or cries. So if we go U.S. UK, I feel qualified to talk about that. So Tony Blinken, who was there with his opposite number, I think in Paris, trying to make amends, say sorry, whatever he was doing, in fluent French. Tony is amazing. My favorite thing about the US-UK is most diplomatic meetings, you've both seen these, are the most undiplomatic things you have ever seen, in the bad sense, like little mini flags for each country. And it's just this awful hierarchical pyramid flattened out on a long, skinny table. And then the second most important person, and then the third, and they're all sitting looking at their opposite number. And then the most junior and often the smartest person sitting on the edges just taking notes. And this is just the stupid theater that we do to one another. So the first time I meet Tony Blinken, who's our Secretary of State, he's Deputy Secretary, I mean, he's a friend on the side, but he was newly appointed Deputy Secretary of State. He's got a meeting with Cameron and his team at number 10, and we're kind of running late, and we go, and we know how it's all supposed to be set up. And the same thing is true in the Oval Office, right? You've got the two chairs next to the fireplace where the two most important, same thing. So Tony comes in, he sits in the absolute wrong chair. And you could just see everyone be like, ugh. And then I was like, it's okay. And then he does the unthinkable. He pulls out a sheet of paper and a pen, and he asks the most junior person in the room, who he recognizes, who's an expert on what's going on in Turkey as it relates to the Syrian civil war, and just starts saying, what do you think about that? Open-ended, curious questions to a really smart person who is the lowest ranking person in the room. And I was like, this is what diplomacy looks like. This is what partnership looks like. And we had real disagreements, without getting into it, about what ought to happen. And it was just like normal meetings we all have with teams that are in flow and functioning. And what we do, when we use, and I must have made this mistake 1,000 times, we are trained to say the following. There is no daylight between the United States and the United Kingdom as it relates to, and then fill in whatever topic you want. And that is a ludicrous standard for cooperation. Yeah. It is never true, and I'm so glad it's never true. Because if you picture two of our soldiers fighting shoulder to shoulder in World War II, a couple dancing on a dance floor, any image of partnership, there was always daylight between them. If it weren't, it would be creepy and ineffective.
Yeah. And it's a question of, everything is relative, right, to the daylight that we see between our countries and many others.
And it's daylight. Like, what's so scary about daylight?
I'm going to come to some of the audience questions. There's some really great questions. And for those of you who have a question but haven't typed it in on your phone, please do, because it's been a long time since we've been together in the same room. So take advantage of it. It's overwhelmingly great. I'm going to start. I know you're going to tell us a little bit about your thoughts on what America can and should do together with the rest of the world to make sure that we get shots in arms and bring our world back. But let me first ask a question from Oliver. If they meet in Glasgow, COP26, what is the first thing that... Oh, wow, this is great. What is the first thing that Biden should say to Putin? Daniel, I'm going to let you take that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Daniel.
So everybody, I guess Putin will be there. Biden will be there.
Well, okay, so I would have, the day before yesterday, I've been hopeless at answering this question, but I yesterday chaired a meeting with David Owen, and I listened carefully, obviously, to what he said. So David is of the view that that we have treated Putin entirely disrespectfully and only as an enemy, and that we lead only with the human rights issues, but that Putin actually wants to be a world player, and that one of the things that Biden should do is try to talk to him and include him in his plans. He suggested the Middle East is not a bad starting place, where the interests were maybe, both countries had interests that maybe coincided with each other, because Putin does have a focus also in Islamic fundamentalism, and that's an issue for him domestically. So David's suggestion was that the first things that we should be saying to him would be cooperative things, developing a common agenda. He doesn't think we should back off of the issues like Skripal and the role that Putin has played in trying to influence elections, but he thinks that that Russia expects to be treated like a major European power, and it always has been a major European power, and sometimes we're inclined to patronize it in its current view because communism was a failure, and that has produced a resistance. And so the first thing that he ought to be saying will be something that gets over the impression that he is listening to them and cooperative with them, without, of course, walking away from the serious questions we have over his human rights record.
It is the toughest thing, isn't it? How you cooperate and compete at the same time. That's the thing that Biden says he wants to do with everybody. And to be fair to the Biden administration, the first thing they did with Russia was to extend New START. So it was a cooperative move before they started sort of taking a harder line. But we saw the meeting between President Biden and President Putin, which was an interesting combination of the two. How did you read that? But also, Matthew,
I think
what
Daniel,
should he say when he gets to COP26?
I like what Daniel said. I thought that was very wise, and so thank you, David. By way of Daniel, I think that's all very smart. I mean, we all know, it is really unproductive to talk with someone who is convinced they're right. I mean, it's just, I remember I was telling you the story of this wonderful woman who was the #2 at USAID, kind of like the formerly DFID thing, foreign aid, and I was working at Sweden at the time, and I said, how do we do more coordination of foreign aid? Because Sweden's really generous as a percentage of GDP. We're really generous in total dollars. And she said, yes, in my 32 years, here's what I've learned about coordination. So I leaned forward, and she said, everyone loves coordination. No one likes to be coordinated. And to your point, it's like, we all know what it's like to be told what to do and get in line, and it doesn't, yield very positive results. But quickly on competition and cooperation, I won't go into it because we have other questions, but to Daniel's really good point on growth, and just for the UK, for the United States, growth and sharing it in our democracies as a huge thing. The number one, and I get into this a little bit in my book, but the largest commercial entity in the world, in dollars transacted, is an incredible thing. You've used it once today, multiple times, is Visa. And if you look at the story of Visa, which you can read about on Wikipedia or in my book, is an unbelievable story of Bank of America, one of the biggest banks in America, giving up power and agreeing to have it treated no better than tiny little banks. And that unleashed, they had to cooperate on a few things, compete on everything else, and it unleashed this unbelievable, engine of growth that is hard to. So if you get it right and are rigorous about cooperation and open to competition, you can get some really wonderful results.
I'm going to come to the question about Kamala Harris. She sort of got a lot of headlines for a short period of time, and then we haven't really talked much about her, actually. She was given some tough portfolios like the southern border. She was sent to Singapore, I think, which was an important meeting when the world was focused on Afghanistan. But it's been tough, and I think people perhaps are skeptical. The question from Stephen, which has multiple likes, is given her positions in the 2020 primary, surely a President Kamala Harris would be an authentic revolutionary. So setting aside the, whether or how realistic it is, do you think, how do you judge kind of where she is, but really what she would do if she had the platform?
Well, she has to win, right? Yeah. So one of the things about it is I don't think the presidency is there to win from a quite left democratic position. There's a big question as to why she didn't do better in the presidential nomination, because originally she looked like the obvious choice. She's got a lot of personality, and I thought she was bound to do very well, and she actually did quite badly quite quickly. There may be a lot of reasons for that, but I don't think the presidency is there to win in that position, so she'll have to adapt that position. There'll also be a question of whether Joe Biden's coattails are ones that help her or hinder her. But she has to not just win the nomination, but win the presidential election. And Joe Biden didn't win the presidential election by much in quite favorable circumstances, which was what had happened to Trump over COVID, where he clearly mishandled it, even with his base voters. With his sort of clearly his low ratings for competence, and Joe Biden in a very moderate position, which was quite attractive, and he only just won. So I would have some questions as to whether there'll even be a President Harris. But if there is, I don't think she'd be able to do it from that position, because you're not alone in a political system.
So Matthew, in addition to the question, let me just draw out what Daniel said. Do you see Kamala Harris as a progressive?
Well, that's what I was going to. It's tricky for me. Yeah, I guess so. But she's a former prosecutor too, right? So what I think her strength can be, to your point, that she will have to demonstrate, is what I think voters are hungry for is showing that you can work through things together. And I think, as I think of this, my politics, not hers, she's obviously very talented, that you pick the topic in America, it's sort of true over here too. A whole bunch of people want to end it. End this, end that. Most recently in America, end a woman's right to choose about her reproductive freedom. So lots of stuff, or end policing as we know it, so depending left and right. End it, end it, end it. And what that does is brings out immediately and predictably the defend it crowd. End it, defend it, end it, defend it. I think there is huge opportunity for anyone who wants to be in the let's mend it and amend it thing, which is what voters really want. If you can do it, it's hard, it takes work. I think it's what Daniel talks about in in your wonderful book on moderation. But I don't think, I'm curious. Wait, that's another question.
Go on, sorry.
Well, I'm just curious about moderation, because it's such a important word and loaded. And I remember when I was talking, I would look at these talking points every week during the awful, horrific Syrian civil war. And the talking points would say, we are making meaningful strides, US and the UK, building the moderate opposition. And then I was just imagining like recruiting people, if your little tent at the recruiting fair said, please come and fight and potentially die for the moderate opposition.
Right. But
how long would that queue be? And so, but you talk
Yes.
about and think about this.
Because the thing is that no one wants to frame themselves as that. I'll use the example of assisted dying because it's quite an interesting one, right? Obviously, what the best way, if you actually want to win the battle over assisted dying, is to frame it as legalizing what we currently do, right? Because we currently already allow people to assist other people dying, either in Switzerland or even in the UK, without prosecuting them, but the law is very unclear. Right, that's one way to frame it. But people who are in favour of it would prefer to frame it as a great radical change along the lines of votes for women or the Race Relations Act, because that's quite a nice feeling, right? And there isn't much of a queue in front of people proposing moderation or being. Despite the fact that I think that's what people want. I think you think that too. So, you know, one of the things that I think that maybe Kamala Harris found difficult was she kind of wanted to project herself as a very exciting figure, and I'm not sure voters want that much excitement. Even though, if you ask them, they might say they did. People like framing things as "I want radical change," but they don't actually. And that's I think what they need is sustainable change that's livable with. And I think if she can cast herself, I think you're right, as a figure who's now governed, who's been in the Senate, who's been a prosecutor. That's a good positioning for her. She could win the presidency from that. But she may prefer trying to be seen as a transformative figure, and I think she'll lose if she does that.
It's fascinating also because it depends on who the person is. So it's one thing, I mean, Kamala Harris standing up and talking about a radical agenda looks very different from Joe Biden. Just the fact of Kamala Harris, you could argue, is quite transformative. So if you push the envelope that much further, perhaps that's risky. And you could see that she was kind of weighing this up. Should I be a progressive? Should I be a moderate? Where do I position myself, given that she herself was quite unusual for a vice, to be vice president? It does take us really nicely into the question from David, which has multiple thumbs ups. I love this is a great way to do questions, although I miss the voices too. Is there any realistic prospect of a non-Trump devotee becoming the Republican presidential nominee? This is the most important question. Thank you, David, whoever you are. I mean, this is the most important question, and clearly everybody in the audience knows that too from the number of thumb ups. So what do you think, Matthew? Is there a realistic prospect of, I don't know, Mitt Romney, Ben Sass, like who, is there somebody else out there, a never Trumper, or is it?
Yeah, building on what Daniel said, so I don't know who it is. It's not my party. I think they will do it. I'm curious what they would say about Dan. I don't think they will dress themselves in moderate clothing to achieve that. I think they need to maybe just stick up for, let's just be conservative. And conservative, a major strand of it was sticking up for your British definition of liberal, sort of Economist magazine liberal, like free trade, free speech, free people, that kind of, let's conserve that. And let's conserve America's tradition of interdependence and division of, you could run as a real conservative and try to be the standard bearer for that. I think
that's right. Look, the first thing is that nobody they choose who isn't Trump will be as bad as Trump, right? In a narcissism competition, they're going to come second. This person, right? So I think that they will. If they selected Ron DeSantis, for example, who clearly is angling for it, that would be better than Trump. But it just. Unfortunately, wouldn't still not be that good. Trump has dragged this party into. There are lots of things you can say about democracy, but the one good thing about it is it ensures a smooth transition which people accept as legitimate between one party and another. It isn't that great as an accountability mechanism. It doesn't often measure what people think. There are lots of things that are wrong, where you can say democracy fails, but it does do that one thing. And he tried to drive a stake through that one thing that it really does achieve. And that was a very deeply evil thing to try to do. And they went along with it. And everybody went along with it, in my view, isn't fit for public office. However, they're still better than him.
So we only have... We only have a minute left, so I'm going to come to one particular question, partly because it gives our wonderful authors an opportunity to clarify their position.
Oh dear.
And also because it gives you a moment to sort of sum up what your thinking is on Joe Biden, quiet revolutionary, where's America going under his leadership. If Joe, and this is anonymously written, if Joe Biden, with lots of thumbs up, if Joe Biden is so good as the speakers seem to believe, why is he polling so badly? So I'm going to let you go first, Daniel, and then you, Matthew, and then I think we're going to be out of time.
First of all, like, he's flawed in lots of different ways. I don't think he's the most brilliant person ever, but I do admire him in lots of ways. The answer to that is that as a measure of either what I think or even of what the electorate thinks, certainly the former of those, but I would say both, today's polling is not a very good measure of it. It tells you how you'd vote in a presidential election in which he was the candidate that isn't happening. And people don't know how to answer that question very well. So my answer is I think he's polling adequately, and I don't think it necessarily, and Harry Truman, now considered one of the greatest presidents ever, it polled really badly, so it's not necessarily a good measure of what I think, of what people think, or what history will think.
Thank you. Matthew.
The only thing I would add to what Daniel said, I agree entirely, both on his imperfections and the relative from going to 55 to 48 job approval or 44%, If you go in with the mindset of let me preserve my above water approval rating, you can conduct yourself one way. Other politicians, I think he's doing this, you invest whatever political capital you have, which usually means, just like your bank account, it goes down while you invest it, and hopefully it comes back again.
This has been tremendous.
I'm going to sign the books.
And there is a book signing. It's in this building. Don't leave, but it's sort of down the corridor and at Waterstones here, and our authors will be there, and we'd love to see you in person signing books, and thank you so much for turning up.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Like flowers cultivate in cracks in the concrete, culture grows in the spaces between the everyday. It's there in darkened rooms when the stage lights come on. It's in a park full of people belting out the same song. It happens in classrooms, having a go, hands-on. It's found in small circles, exchanging stories. It's under a tent, making brand new discoveries. It's in those shared experiences that help build communities. It inspires change, provides opportunities. It brings joy, sparks curiosity. It provokes feelings recognizable to everyone, making our hearts race and giving us goosebumps. It's for those who don't think they can have it. It's for those who know that they need it. It fosters connection and understanding. It is ours for the taking, as well as the sharing. Culture is what makes us human. It makes our world better. Culture is our culture. Let's explore it together.
We love reading stories throughout the day and especially at bedtime. So yeah, now we've got a new one to read.
It's brilliant to get them out and about. And when I told them this morning, I said, do you want to go see Joe Wicks? They were so excited.
It was nice to see the man that kind of got you, or helped you through lockdown. Very motivating. Definitely see that he's passionate about his family. That certainly came through. Yeah, it was really, really good.
So Shoe Wars is a shoe-tastic tale that features the Foot family, Ivor, Ruby and Barefoot, who live in the shoe town, in the Shoebox estate. And every 4 years, the towns and the cities across the land compete for the ultimate shoe prize, the Golden Shoe Award.
Put your hand up if you like stories.
Please put your hand up if you've picked your nose today.
Oh, it's brilliant, yeah, it's really, really fun. Lots to see and lots to do, so yeah, really chuffed.
I'm delighted to be here to give this year's Sunday Times Award for Literary Excellence. The recipient of this year's award is the Italian writer Elena Ferrante.
I'm a career author, I'm a career writer. It began as a financial choice that my agent said to me, now you can do it. And then what followed was one of the most beautiful creative journeys I've ever been on in my life.
Loads of people wrote books during lockdown, didn't they? And I was another one. I had never seen my story reflected anywhere growing up. I never saw anybody who, lived like me or looked like me or had lived that experience, and I'm definitely not in any books.
Jennifer had seen a little advert and encouraged me to go along for this audition with her. And we didn't really have a double act at that point, we just thought it looked like good fun. And what we didn't know was that, of course, they didn't have any women on the bill at all, and they were starting to look very un-PC for not having women. So actually, any women that walked in the door at that moment was going to get the job, and that happened to be us. You can't say that's not lucky.